The morning was draped in a thick veil of fog, the kind that swallowed sound and made everything feel farther away than it really was. Damp air clung to my coat, soaking into the seams as gravel crunched beneath my boots. I walked that forgotten stretch of road just outside the village, where the forest pressed in close on both sides and the world seemed to hold its breath. That's when I heard it, a sound so fragile, so fleeting, I almost thought I'd imagined it. A high, broken mewl. I turned toward the ditch, and that's when I saw her. A cat, barely recognizable as one, curled in on herself like a bundle of bones wrapped in dirty fur, her body trembling with every shallow breath. Flies crawled along her ears, her eyes, her open wounds. Her mouth moved once more, parting slightly to release a second, rasping cry that barely rose above the silence. My breath caught in my throat. I don't know why I stopped. Maybe it was guilt, maybe something deeper. But something in her, despite the rot, despite the filth, despite the nearness of death, looked straight through me, like she'd been waiting for someone to see her before it was too late. And in that moment, I couldn't walk away. As I knelt beside her, the sharp scent of decay and sickness was overwhelming, blending with the cool moisture of the morning mist. Her frail form shivered uncontrollably beneath the coarse touch of my fingertips, and the flies scattered momentarily before stubbornly returning to crawl over her crusted wounds. Her body was ice cold, and yet a faint pulse still fluttered, whispering of life still clinging by a fragile thread. Carefully I lifted her, feeling the brittle bones shift beneath her matted fur, my heart racing as I whispered gently, "You're okay now, I've got you." My own words felt hollow, uncertain, and as much to reassure myself as they were to soothe her. But even as her weak cry faded, her half-open eyes seemed to cling to mine, searching, hoping. On the way back into the village, the dirt road felt impossibly long, my breath misting in quick, anxious puffs as I pressed her small body closer against my chest. My mind raced with worry. Could she even survive this? Where had she come from, and how long had she been suffering alone? When I reached Elena's small farmhouse shelter at the outskirts of town, she stood in the doorway, eyes narrowed in concern. She rushed toward me, peeling back the cloth I'd hastily wrapped around the trembling creature. Elena's expression darkened as she saw the cat clearly. "Matei," she murmured gravely, shaking her head. "She's in terrible shape, but she's fighting." Inside the dim, warm kitchen, surrounded by medical supplies and gently humming heaters, I carefully set the dying cat down. Elena's expression softened, but the tension lingered between us, a silent acknowledgement of uncertainty and of the thin line between hope and despair. The shelter was quiet that morning, just the hum of space heaters, the occasional rustle of paws behind crates, and Elena muttering to herself as she prepared warm saline. I sat cross-legged on the floor beside the low table where we'd laid the cat, watching the rise and fall of her ribs. She still hadn't moved, her eyes barely opened, but she was alive. Elena worked with calm precision, trimming away crusted fur, dabbing ointment over sores, removing dirt from her gums and ears. "She's been out there a long time," she said softly. "Maggots in the wound. She's septic. But if she's made it this far, there's a chance." That word, chance, stuck in my head. Over the next few hours, we found more. Alinka, the shy teenager who helped Elena on weekends, spotted a pair of glowing eyes under the woodpile out back. One cat, black as soot, broad-shouldered, with a long scar over one eye, hissed and backed away. Another, a stripy kitten, darted straight into a hollow in the wall. By noon, we had 3 more, all dirty, all hungry, all suspicious. Elena looked at me. "They're part of the same colony," she said. "You stumbled into something bigger than one rescue." Radu, the farmer who lived down the road, passed by and saw the cluster of carriers outside the shelter. He snorted. "Waste of time," he muttered. "Some things are better left to nature." But I couldn't agree. Something about the way that dying cat had looked at me. She hadn't given up, and now, neither could I. 3 long, blurred days passed beneath a ceiling of cold gray clouds and sleepless thoughts. I came every morning and stayed well into the dusk, returning to the same small corner of the shelter where Lena lay wrapped in soft fleece and silence. She hadn't moved more than a twitch of her whiskers, hadn't taken food or even flinched at the sound of doors opening or boots crunching on the wooden floor. Her breathing was shallow, Her eyes barely opened, slits beneath crusted lids, and yet I kept talking to her as if my words could reach someplace pain couldn't. I told her about the frost crawling along the fence posts outside, about the firewood stacked too high in my shed, about my father's old dog and the silent way animals grieve. I didn't know why I talked. Maybe because it made her real to me, more than a body giving in to the cold. Then, just past sunrise on the fourth day, Elena's voice shook down the walls of my quiet. She called me with an urgency I hadn't heard before, sharp, breathless, a tremble buried beneath her usual calm. When I arrived, Lena wasn't lying where I had left her. Instead, she was curled in a new spot, just a few feet away, her fragile limbs barely supporting her weight, but unmistakably moved by her own will. Elena's eyes, wide with awe and something close to fear, met mine. She got up, Mate, not far, but she moved. Then, she stopped breathing. Her words spilled out in a low, fast whisper, as if she was still afraid to believe it herself. Lena's heart had flatlined, her body gone still for what felt like minutes, and Elena, who had once cradled dying people in her arms as a nurse, had felt that old familiar cold. But Lena came back. No machines, no heroics, just breath, again, as if something inside her clawed its way back from the edge because it wasn't ready to let go. I stared at her, not knowing what to say, and that's when I noticed it. Toma, the old tomcat we'd brought in 2 days earlier, now pacing like a caged shadow across the back of the shelter. His ears were flat, tail twitching, eyes locked not on us but on her. Every time Lena whimpered, Toma froze. His entire body stiffened like he was listening to something older than memory, some instinct pulled from deeper places. He didn't growl, he didn't run. He just watched, protective, alert, and trembling with tension. And in that strange electric moment, I realized something we hadn't seen before. Toma knew her, not as a fellow stray, not as another cat caught in the same storm. He remembered her, and just like that, this stopped being a rescue story. It became a story about something lost, and maybe something on the verge of being found again. The discovery settled over us like a shifting weight, soft at first, then heavy with questions that no one wanted to ask aloud. For the rest of that day, the shelter felt different. Not louder, not busier, but brimming with something unspoken, like the air itself had thickened in the wake of Lena's quiet defiance against death. Elena, for all her years of hardened experience, became uncharacteristically still as she watched Lena rest. There was no medical explanation for what had happened. Cats in her condition didn't get up, they didn't stop breathing and then return, and they certainly didn't stir a reaction like the one Toma had given. Elena said little, but her silence was thoughtful, the kind that marked a woman unraveling a mystery in pieces she couldn't yet fit together. Toma wouldn't leave the far side of the room. He stalked, circled, paced, always just out of reach, always with eyes pinned to Lena's tiny frame. He never hissed, never growled, but there was something guarded in his movements, something strained. When Alinka came in after school, humming to herself and holding a can of food, even she paused at the door, noticing the tension that had replaced the usual sleepy stillness. She placed the food down and knelt near Toma, whispering gently, trying to coax him closer, but he ignored her. His attention was singular. I felt something shift in me, too. It had started the moment Lena cried out, but now it grew louder, more present. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about connection. I was no longer trying to save a life. I was stepping into something larger than me, a web of unseen threads that bound these animals together and somehow had now begun to pull me in. That evening, as the wind picked up outside and the trees clawed against the windows like restless fingers, the fragile calm of the shelter began to crack. The heater in the back room failed, a small thing, easily overlooked on any other night, but with 3 of the weaker cats sleeping there, it became urgent. Elena and I scrambled to set up heat pads and relocate crates, the cats mewling low with confusion and discomfort. The cold had a way of slipping into everything that night, not just the room, but beneath the skin and behind the eyes. Then, as I stepped outside to bring in another blanket from Elena's car, I saw them, 2 sets of eyes glinting just beyond the fence line. Feral cats, watching, still. One limped with a crooked leg, the other crouched, ready to bolt. They didn't approach, didn't cry out, just stared, like they were waiting for something, or someone. When I told Alina, she wasn't surprised. "There's a whole colony out there," she said with a sigh, rubbing the back of her neck. "Always has been, but they've never come this close." I felt the unease creeping in then. Something had changed. Lena's rescue hadn't gone unnoticed. Word had spread, not in the way humans speak it, but in the low, wild language of survival and scent, the silent alerts of movement and instinct. The others were circling now, maybe looking for her, maybe mourning her, maybe warning us. And Radu, the farmer, returned the next morning with a shotgun in the back of his truck. "They're crawling through my field now," he muttered. "Mark my words, something needs to be done." Whatever this had been before, a moment of mercy, a small act of kindness, it was turning into something more complicated and more dangerous. By the end of the week, the lines between compassion and consequence had begun to blur. I found myself lingering at the shelter longer than I should, not just tending to Lena, but watching over the others, drawn deeper into the quiet war between their survival and our intentions. Each cat had its own rhythm, its own pace of trust and withdrawal. Toma's restless pacing had eased into protective stillness near Lena, while Sora, the tabby kitten, only emerged in the hush of late evening to eat quickly and vanish again into the dark corners of the storage closet. Elena had begun asking the hard questions. What happens if Lena survives? Will I take her in? Should she be released with the others? Was I prepared for that kind of bond, to commit not just to her healing, but to her future? The idea of letting her go felt unbearable, yet the thought of keeping her came with its own ache. I hadn't come back to this town looking for attachment. I'd come looking for quiet, for stillness, for forgetting. But now, with Lena resting her head against my palm and her eyes flicking open just long enough to find mine, I started to wonder if I'd stumbled into something that wouldn't let me go that easily. The tension didn't erupt. It crept, like a shadow stretching farther each day, threading itself through quiet glances and interrupted routines. The cats grew restless at night. Lena began to stir more often, no longer still as stone but shifting beneath her blanket, attempting to stand on legs that weren't ready. Toma rarely left her side now, and though he never made a sound, his gaze had turned guarded, as if he knew something we didn't. Then, one morning, she was gone. Panic hit like a slap of cold water. Her blanket lay empty, the crate door nudged open ever so slightly, the lock unlatched. No blood, no fur, no signs of a struggle, just absence, hollow and loud. We searched the shelter, calling out her name though we knew she wouldn't answer. The corners, the cellar, the sheds, nothing. The others were still there, as if they hadn't even noticed or didn't care. But Toma had. His pacing had returned, fierce and agitated, eyes flicking toward the door with every gust of wind. Ilinka found the first clue, a small muddy paw print just outside the back window, pressed into the sill like a whisper, and near it, the mark of another, bigger, heavier, pressed deeper into the wet soil. Elena and I looked at each other then, understanding dawning like frost underfoot. Something or someone had come for her. But why? And more unsettling, how had they known where she was? The lines between what we rescued and what we invited had begun to blur, and now the forest seemed to be watching. The following days passed with a heaviness that settled over the shelter like a blanket of fog that wouldn't lift. Every routine felt disrupted, every sound sharper than usual. Even the cats had changed. Toma grew distant, no longer pacing but staring for hours at the door. Lena had vanished through, his body still, tense, as if listening for footsteps only he could hear. Sora wouldn't come out at all now, not even for food. And Negru, the silent, scarred black cat, had begun to howl at night, long, low cries that echoed off the walls and made sleep impossible. Ilinka started bringing in small trinkets, cat toys, worn scarves, even a piece of old bread shaped like a heart, leaving them near the spot where Lena used to sleep, as if some offering might coax her spirit back. I didn't have the heart to tell her I wasn't sure Lena was dead. It was worse, not knowing. Worse to imagine her dragged into the forest, bleeding and alone, or worse still, not alone. I kept seeing those eyes at the fence line, watching us that night, and I started to wonder if this was never about saving just one cat. Elena withdrew slightly, her once practical calm now strained with something more personal. "I've seen colonies like this before," she murmured one evening. "Tangled bloodlines, hidden bonds, cats that grieve like people. It's not just instincts, it's history. She didn't explain further, but I could feel the truth of it in her words. There was something ancient at work here, something deeper than our intentions. And for me, something had begun to crack. I wasn't just feeding and cleaning and caring, I was watching, learning their rhythms, their silent exchanges, the way Negru would place his body in front of the door each dusk, as though guarding something or waiting. I found myself lingering outside longer, staring into the woods, wondering if the forest would answer back. It was the 9th night since Lena had vanished when the conflict that had been simmering finally rose to the surface. The shelter had turned into a tension coil, tight, quiet, ready to snap. Elena was the first to say what I could see forming in all of us. "We can't keep them all," she said, standing by the window, arms crossed, eyes locked on the tree line beyond the garden. "We're not equipped. It's irresponsible." But her voice was too hard, too final, like she was trying to convince herself as much as me. Toma had grown thinner, refusing food. He barely blinked anymore. His loyalty had transformed into grief, maybe even guilt, and watching him wither made something twist in my chest in a way I couldn't explain. The others too were changing. Negru no longer howled. He'd gone silent, too silent. That night, I found him sitting on top of the crate where Lena once slept, his eyes not closed, not open, but lost somewhere in between. The final thread unraveled when Radu returned, more agitated than ever. "They're multiplying," he said, slamming the back of his truck shut. "Coming down from the hills, killing chickens now. I want them gone, all of them." He looked at me like it was my fault, like I'd summoned this trouble with one act of misplaced kindness. That evening, Elena brought up rehoming again. "We can find fosters," she said. "There are rescues in Bucharest." But I could already see what that meant. Sora would never last a day in a house. Toma would stop eating altogether. And Negru, he belonged to the dusk. And that's when the question broke open, raw and unavoidable. Were we trying to save them from the world, or from the very lives they knew? Something had to be decided. But whatever choice we made, it would cost us something. The air had turned brittle by morning, the kind of cold that crept in through the seams of the windows and settled into your bones no matter how many layers you wore. Tension had sunk into every corner of the shelter, like dust you couldn't sweep out. It wasn't just the cats anymore. It was us, the people. The ones who had stepped in thinking we could fix something, only to find ourselves caught in the middle of something far more ancient and tangled than we could have imagined. Alinka was the first to cry. She didn't even speak, just stood in the middle of the room with her hands clenched into fists and tears tracking down her cheeks, as Elena told her as gently as she could that some of the cats might have to be relocated. "It's not fair," she whispered, voice cracking. "They didn't ask for this." And she was right. They hadn't. None of them had asked to be rescued or handled or moved. They had only survived, as best they could. Elena, ever the realist, stood by her decision. "If we don't start moving them, we'll lose control. We'll lose all of them." She meant it as a warning, but it landed like a verdict. And in that moment, something inside me hardened. Later, when the others had left, I sat alone in the shelter, the sky outside bleeding into early night. Negru came to rest by my feet, heavy and silent. Sora crept out and brushed against my leg, and Toma curled into the empty crate where Lena had once lain and didn't move. And I realized, finally, that this wasn't about saving cats anymore. It was about choosing who we were willing to become for them. Were we caretakers? Were we intruders? Or were we just afraid of what would happen if we let go? That night, sleep refused to come. I lay awake, listening to the wind scrape against the roof and the shelter groan with the weight of decisions none of us wanted to make. Every sound outside made my chest tighten, the crack of branches, the snap of frost, the distant bark of a dog. My mind circled back to Lena, her cry, her body wrapped in flies, and that impossible moment when she opened her eyes and pulled herself back from death. I had never believed in signs, but that memory wouldn't let me rest. It felt like a question left unfinished. At dawn, I returned to the shelter. Everything looked the same, yet something felt different. The cats were awake before I entered, restless, alert. Toma was standing near the door, something he never did. He wasn't pacing or crying, just watching, waiting. Then I saw it. the latch on the back gate ajar. I stepped outside into the frost-covered yard, and that's when I saw the prints again. Small, light, weaving across the soil and then vanishing into the trees, Lena's prints, and beside them, the deeper, broader ones. Not human, not quite feline either. Larger, wilder. I followed the path to the edge of the forest where the trees grew close together and shadows clung like a second skin. And there, in the clearing just beyond the first row of trunks, were eyes. Not one pair, not two, but many. Low to the ground, silent, watching, waiting. Something surged in my chest. Fear, awe, I couldn't tell. But I knew this was the turning point. Lena hadn't been stolen. She had returned to something we couldn't understand. And now the forest, it was asking a question of me. Not in words, but in presence. Was I ready to follow? I stepped into the woods before I had time to question what I was doing. The cold pressing in close as branches clawed at my coat and frost cracked beneath my boots. The forest swallowed sound, muffling each step until it felt like I was moving through breath, not air. The prints were clear. Lena's delicate paw marks side by side with the deeper, heavier ones, and they pulled me forward like a trail of thoughts I hadn't dared to follow before. The deeper I went, the more the world behind me seemed to dissolve, until there was only the hush of wind through the trees and the thrum of my own heartbeat in my ears. The clearing wasn't large, just a dip in the earth where leaves had gathered, rimmed with fallen logs and shafts of morning light filtering through the trees like strands of gold. And there she was, Lena. Thin still, but standing, alive. Her coat dull, but her eyes wide open, fixed on me with a recognition that felt more ancient than any bond I'd ever known. Around her, the others emerged, cats with torn ears and matted fur, eyes bright and wary. Negru, silent and majestic, stepped forward from the brush. And beside him, Toma. I hadn't even heard him follow me. They didn't scatter. They didn't run. They accepted him, and her, and somehow me. It was not a rescue. Not anymore. It was a return, a crossing of lines, a choice. I crouched slowly, extending my hand, not to take Lena back, but to tell her, without words, that I understood now. Some things don't belong in cages, not even kind ones. Some things survive not because they're saved, but because they choose to endure together. And in that moment, I let her go, not with sorrow, but with reverence. I returned to the village alone, though I didn't feel alone in the way I once had. The path back through the forest was no less silent, no less cold, but something had shifted in the stillness. A weight lifted, not because the ending was easy, but because it was honest. At the edge of the trees, I paused and looked back once, not expecting to see anything, but needing to leave part of myself behind. Somewhere beyond the trunks and frost, Lena was alive, no longer clinging to life, but choosing it, surrounded by those who remembered her, those who had waited. She didn't belong in our world of walls and soft blankets and well-meaning intentions. She belonged where survival meant something more sacred, where it was earned, understood, and shared. At the shelter, the air felt lighter. Toma never returned, but the others slowly began to settle. Negru, in his quiet way, became a presence more than a pet, watchful, steady, a keeper of unseen borders. Sora grew bold enough to rest in windowsills and chase sunbeams, her skittishness replaced by something that looked almost like trust. Elena no longer spoke of relocation. Even Radu, though still grim in his warning, stopped short of threats. The village had felt the tremor of what we'd disturbed, and somehow even the most skeptical among us seemed to know that something ancient had brushed past us and chosen to leave us intact. And me, I stayed. Not just in the village, but in the stillness. I kept walking the forest path each morning, not searching, but listening. The rescue had never been about saving a life. It had been about witnessing one, recognizing it, and letting it move beyond us. Lena's cry for help hadn't just pulled her back from the edge. It had reached into something buried deep in me and brought it, slowly, back to life. Sometimes, healing doesn't look like bringing something home. Sometimes, it's knowing when to open your hands and let the wild keep what was always its own. If Lena's story touched something in you, if it made you pause, made you remember, or made you feel just a little closer to something wild and true, then I hope you'll carry that with you. These stories don't always have neat endings. Sometimes the most powerful moments are the ones that leave us with questions, not answers. But maybe that's the point. If you've ever rescued an animal, you know that not every bond fits into a home, not every goodbye is a loss, and not every cry for help needs a cage at the end of it. If this story meant something to you, I invite you to subscribe and stay with me. There are more stories to tell, some hard, some healing, all real. Share this with someone who needs to believe in quiet miracles again. And if you've got a story of your own, maybe it's time to tell it. Until next time, keep listening for the voices that speak without words. They're still out there.